Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of my foray into solar power and self-generation of electricity. In this video, I thought I would just show some graphs and talk about what those graphs show. These graphs have all been generated from the inverters, and I've also got a graph that shows my electricity usage from my electricity company, where you can see the first little signs that things are dropping off in terms of how much I've bought from them for the last month. It's not a complete month, but it's a good start so far. So without further ado, I'll show you some of the graphs. So here is an example of a pretty good day where the sun was shining in the sky all day, almost no clouds, and you can see we get this lovely bell-shaped curve. The green line on this diagram is how much solar power is actually hitting the panels. The red line is how much power the inverter is converting to AC, and the blue line is how much power is being fed to or from the grid. So you can see here when the day starts, there's a small blue line below the 0 watts line early in the morning, and that's just sort of the background usage in the house, so from the fridge and the freezer and some sort of electric clocks and that sort of thing. So that's our sort of general background usage that's always there, and you can see because it's below the line, that means we're taking energy in from the grid to satisfy that. The sudden spike you can see sort of at about 7 o'clock in the morning is where we've gotten up and put the kettle on, and obviously that draws a significant amount of power for a very short period from the grid to boil the kettle. So you get that little sharp spike, blue spike pointing downwards, showing that we've pulled in some energy there. And then after that you can see that the sun's coming up, and the green line starts to come up from 0 and steadily builds. Now, because we have a battery in the system, the initial energy generated by the solar panels is actually fed straight into the battery, which is why you can see that up until about 9:30, 10 o'clock ish, the red line is almost flat, and that's because the DC coming from the solar panels is being fed straight into the battery to charge up the battery. So there's very little of it left, and the inverter is only converting a small amount of the DC into AC to help cover the sort of general household usage at that time. So that's why there's a small amount of the red line just above 0 watts. You can see at about 10 o'clock ish, suddenly the red line and the blue line shoot up to meet the green line. Now this is because the battery is now full, and so all the solar powered energy from the panels is being converted to AC by the inverter, and all of it is, or pretty much most of it, is being fed back to the grid. So the lines all follow each other all the way through, and then you see we get a couple of dips in the afternoon either side of sort of midday, and that'll be where we more than likely put the dishwasher on. So the dishwasher will heat the water, and that will draw a significant amount of power to heat the water. But you see, because we're already generating about 4 kilowatts at that stage, all of that demand to heat the water is satisfied by just what's available from the solar panels. So what happens is that we stop exporting so much, and we're starting to use some of that in the house ourselves. And then once the water's been heated by the dishwasher and it goes into its sort of wash cycle, you can see that the blue line comes back up again, and so we're exporting all of this spare power back to the grid. And then a bit later on, the dishwasher does the rinse cycle, and again it heats some water up to do that, so you get a second dip there. And then after that's done, the whole rest of the energy for the rest of the afternoon is way more than we're using. We'll all be out at work and school, so it's all just being exported out to the grid. And then at around sort of 4-5 o'clock ish, we all come home, and you get a sudden big draw of energy from the inverter, where we've more than likely switched the oven on to start preparing tea. So here we've got a situation where the amount of energy coming from the inverter is greater than the amount of solar energy that's available, which is why the red line is above the green line. But you see that the blue line doesn't go negative, meaning in order to satisfy the demand for this extra power, we're not actually having to draw any from the grid. And what's happening here is that we're actually digging into the battery. So the inverter is taking some energy from the battery and some energy that's still available from the solar, and meeting the demand from the oven. And then obviously once the oven is finished, you see that red line drops back down below the green line. So now there's a small amount of solar energy being used to charge the battery up again, but it's only for a short period before the sun eventually drops right down. And then into the evening there, you can see now that we're not exporting anything to the grid, and we're not importing anything from the grid. The blue line is pretty much sitting on the 0 watts line, and the red line is just power being generated from the battery. So the little spike there is again probably a cup of tea or something like that, kettle gone on. But the rest of it's just sort of background usage, watching telly and the fridge and freezer and that sort of thing being on, until eventually at about it's probably about 10 o'clock-ish, 10:30ish, right at the end there, you can see that the power being generated by the inverter drops off to 0, and that's because the battery is then empty. And we at that point start pulling power in from the grid, which is why the blue line then drops below the 0 watts line. On this graph, this is an example of a pretty bad day. So this is a really, really grey, overcast day. Not even a break in the clouds. It's one of those really horrible, dark, grey, gloomy days all day long. So again, what you can see here is at the start of the day, you've got the background usage. We're pulling in energy from the grid, and then suddenly at about 7 o'clock, we all sort of start getting up. The sun comes up, and there's very, very little solar energy. It's about 500 watts in total coming from all the panels on the roof, which is not very much at all, and not even enough to satisfy the sort of general house usage. So you can see there's still parts where we're pulling in energy from the grid, and then at about 9 o'clock, there's just about enough solar energy to cover the general usage until about sort of 9:30, when someone probably put the kettle on, and then we've had to pull power in from the grid to satisfy that demand. And then the solar power starts to go up a little bit. We're probably getting up towards about 750 watts there, and then there's a little bit spare. So a tiny little bit probably goes into the battery there, and then suddenly there's a spike in usage there. So and again, the AC power being output by the inverter goes higher than what's available from the solar panel. So what's happening there is it's probably dipped back into that little bit of power it put into the battery, and has used some of that to satisfy that little peak. And then again, that peak of power has gone away, and the amount of solar available is slightly above what we're using. So again, a bit more is trickled into the battery, and then a bit later on we need a bit more than the solar's available, so it would have dug into the battery, and then the sun level drops and drops and drops, and you get a couple of spikes where we're pulling in a lot of energy towards the end of the afternoon, and that again, probably the dishwasher, you usually get two spikes, one where it's heating water for the wash cycle and another where it heats water for the rinse cycle, and there's not enough solar energy to meet that demand, so that's all coming from the grid. That's those two spikes there, and then again the sun's gone right down and we're just drawing energy from the grid the whole time to satisfy the general usage. So pretty much there was no battery power to speak of that day, and so we've pretty much had to rely on the grid to supply our energy. That's a pretty bad day. So here's an example of a day where it's glorious sunshine for half the day, and then suddenly it all clouds over, and you can see that the solar power being generated falls off a cliff pretty much just before 3 o'clock as the clouds suddenly roll in, and you can see from this graph it really clearly demonstrates just how much of a difference it makes between direct sunlight and diffuse sunlight that you get on a sort of an overcast day. So again, here you've got the general usage in the morning, and then the sun comes up, it's a clear sky, so we get big rise in solar power. Initially the inverter is not converting any of it to AC because it's all going into the batteries, but again, just sort of by about 9:30 the battery's full, so then the inverter starts converting all of that DC into AC and exporting it all to the grid, and again you've got a dip in what's being exported to the grid there. Again, that's probably a kettle going on or a vacuum cleaner or something like that, and then some spikes in the afternoon. Just before 3 o'clock there's a big lot of spikes, and that's basically the odd few clouds starting to come over and blocking out the sun, and then finally the main bank of cloud comes over just before 3 o'clock, and yeah, you can see it falls off a cliff. There is a massive difference between what we were generating just before that cloud came over, which is pretty close to about 5 3/4 kilowatts, all the way down suddenly to about 300 or 400 watts. So 5,700 down to about 400, so it's a huge difference. But we've got lots of power in the battery by this stage, so we don't have to pull anything from the grid. And then at about 6 o'clock we probably put the oven on for tea and the kettle, and so there's a big power draw, and in this situation you can only pull so much from the battery safely at any given time, so a lot of it's coming from the battery, but some of it is also being pulled from the grid because it's just too much energy to pull from the battery in one go. So there's a bit of both going on there, and then after that we steadily use up the battery over the course of the evening until about sort of 9 o'clock in the evening, where it runs out, and then we're back to drawing our power from the grid again. In this example here, I just wanted to show this one because you can see here that the amount of power we're feeding in at the top of the curve here is more than the solar power that's available. Now, that shouldn't really be possible, and the only reason that it works like that is because I have got two inverters in my system, and this is the output, the data output from just the main inverter. And it only knows about how much power, solar power, it has available and how much power it's converting to AC, but it measures the total amount being fed back to the grid. So the amount that's being fed back to the grid includes what it's feeding to the grid as well as what the other inverter's feeding to the grid, which is why the blue line goes above the green line and the red line. So if I didn't have two inverters, if I just had this one inverter, the blue line would always be slightly less than the green line, because the green line is the total amount of solar energy available. So once you convert that into AC, you lose a small amount in the conversion process, which is why the red line is slightly below the green line. And then that red line is the AC that you've produced. That would be exported to the grid if you weren't using it. So you would expect the blue line to be slightly less than the red line, because you'd be using some of the energy in the house and only what's left over would be exported. But because we've got the two inverters, we are actually producing AC from the other inverter as well, and this is measuring the fact that we've exported that energy from the other inverter, which is why the blue line is higher than the green line. So I just wanted to show that one. I am looking into a way of potentially intercepting the data coming from the main inverter to see if I can modify it to include the amount being generated by the second inverter before it gets uploaded to this website to produce these graphs, and that would then give me a sort of a correct graph for the entire system. But that's something I'm looking into, and something I'll probably talk about in another video. I've got a few ideas on the way to do that. I wanted to show this graph because this is a sort of a day where you've got a sort of a general sort of bright day, but lots of sort of cloud coming and going over the course of the day. So you can see that we got a lot of red spikes, a sort of a general level of green, which is from the solar panels, but never really more than about 2,000 watts. But you'll notice that over the course of the whole day, we pull almost nothing from the grid, despite the fact that we've gotten all these spikes of energy usage, where the amount of energy we're using is greatly exceeding what's currently available from the solar panels, and yet we don't pull anything in from the grid. And this kind of really demonstrates the smoothing effect of having a battery. So in the morning when the sun first comes up, you see it starts charging. Some of that power is going to charge up the battery, and then you get a sudden spike at about 9 o'clock where we put the kettle on or something, and you see we don't pull any energy from the grid at that point. So what it's doing is it's dipped back into the battery to satisfy the extra energy required. And as soon as the kettle's finished, the energy level drops back down again, and again we get an excess of solar energy, and we charge the battery up some more. Then suddenly there's another big spike of energy usage, which greatly exceeds what the solar panels can produce. And again, we've pulled almost nothing in from the grid, so that extra energy is coming from the battery. Eventually, when that was probably the vacuum cleaner being on or something, and when that's finally switched off, again there's a little bit of spare energy, so we top the battery up a little bit more. Then there's another big lot of usage of energy. So we probably had the washing machine on and the dishwasher and various other things. And again, we've pulled no energy in from the grid there, you see. We've satisfied that extra demand again from the battery. And then eventually that peters off, and again there's an excess of solar energy again, and so the battery's topped back up again with that spare power before there's more peaks in the afternoon, and again they're all being satisfied from the battery. So what I wanted to show by this graph is to show you that just the smoothing effect a battery has. So just by having it top it up a little bit, then dip into it, then top up a bit, and then dip into it, you avoid having to pull energy from the grid during the day, despite the fact that at certain points you're using more than the solar panels can supply at that exact point. But this will all help to sort of keep the electricity bills down, because you can use your own energy that you've produced, just not at the time when you necessarily produced it. And the last graph I wanted to show is this is from my actual electricity supplier, and it shows my electricity usage over the last 12 months. Now you can see that in September their level has dropped a little bit from what's expected, and that's actually before we had the solar panels fitted. That little drop there was because we changed all the light bulbs in the front room to very energy efficient LED bulbs that only draw about 1.2 watts each. So just by changing those bulbs in the front room, which we have on most of the time in the evening, you can see we've made quite a bit of a drop there. But the real key one is the October one, where this is the first month where we've had the solar panels, and it isn't a full month of us having the solar panels. It's about 20 days of the month we had the solar panels, but already from just having 20 days of the solar panels, you can see that our usage is about half what it usually is for this time of year. The sort of thin yellow lines is what my usage was in the previous year. So you can see we've pretty much halved what we used in the previous year. November will be the real tell, because that will be a complete month where we've had the solar panels, and obviously I expect it to be even lower than the October figure. I'll put that up when that appears. But I'm hoping that it'll be probably about 100 kilowatt hours for the month, something like that. Obviously it's a dim time of year now, so the days are not very long, and the nights and the mornings are dark, so usage is a lot higher at this time of year, but I still hope to make a significant dent in that. I can't wait to see what happens when we get to sort of June, July next year, where the days are incredibly long, and we'll have lots and lots of power to spare. So it'll be quite interesting to see how they turn out. But certainly I'm quite impressed with the amount of a saving we've made already, just from 20 days of usage. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to talk about in this video. I've got some ideas for the next video, which involves some sort of hardware work that I'm planning on doing, because I've installed those two inverters in that cupboard. It's potentially going to get quite warm in there, so I'm going to install some fans and experiment with ways of expelling the warm air that's going to build up in there. And I've also got an idea to intercept the data from the inverters so that I can store it for myself. I'm planning on doing that with something like a Raspberry Pi or something like that. So I'm going to start looking into all of that stuff, and my next video should probably be about the progress I'll have made towards doing all of those things, and I've got a few other ideas as well of things I'd like to do. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye.